Calling all authors, the Your Book, Your Voice podcast with host Robert A. Lane features everything you need to know about narrating your audiobook. But it doesn't stop there. We have special guests lined up from all aspects of the book publishing industry, and we also dive deep into what it takes to be mentally prepared for success as an author and in life. So please welcome your host, Robert A. Lane.
Hey, my friends, how are you today? This is the Your Book, Your Voice podcast. I'm your host, Robert A. Lane with Robert Lane Coaching. I'm an audiobook coach and producer. Maybe this is your first time tuning in. Basically, what I do is I help nonfiction authors who have a great published book out there. Maybe you're one of those. Maybe you have a great published book that is out there, but it's not in audiobook form. So what I do as an audiobook coach and producer is help you as the nonfiction author do a fantastic narration of your audiobook and get you published on Audible, Amazon, and Apple in 6 weeks. And I call that the AAA because those are 3 distribution platforms you absolutely need to be on: Audible, Amazon, and Apple. Now, there are, of course, other distribution platforms, but those are the main ones that most of the general public go to. So it is important to be on those platforms. So the audiobook coaching program that I teach takes you through the process. And by the end of the program, you will be published. So love doing it, love helping authors. I come from an entertainment business background, working 30 plus years in the business, 20 plus years doing audio editing, sound design for movies, films, voiceover work, industrials, you name it. But that's all that you get when you work with me as your audiobook coach and producer, is you get coaching and editing, and it's all one nice big package. So if you are interested, by the way, to find out more information, simple step is just scheduling a call with me. We'd love to hear from you. For those of you who can see the video portion of the podcast, there's a graphic on the screen with a link. It's a bit.ly link, which is bit.ly/audiobook onboarding. Again, bit.ly/audiobook onboarding is the link to schedule a free call. It's my calendar. Would love to speak with you. You will talk to me directly, and I always talk to every author before I enroll anybody because I just want to have a personal conversation with you and make sure that I resonate with you and you resonate with me. And the other thing that I want to share with you is that anybody who tunes in today, or even if you go to my website, I have a free audiobook narration reference guide that you can grab, and has some good information in there to give you some tips and pointers and tools and techniques on how to do an awesome audiobook narration. And that link is bit.ly/narration guide, or narration reference guide. Got to get that right. bit.ly, bit.ly/narration reference guide. All right, my friends, I'm really excited about the show that we have for you today because I have a very special guest that we're going to be bringing on. This is not only a great best-selling author and visionary, and definitely a visionary. We'll get into that in just a bit. But I'd like to bring onto the show Mr. Paul Schatzkin, who's written a couple of fantastic books. Paul is, well, first of all, he is an Emmy-nominated editor, or I would say for video editing, received an Emmy nomination for that because Paul's also worked in the entertainment business as well. He's done some incredible things in his career. He has taken people sailing in Hawaii. He helped create the first internet music business in Nashville, Tennessee, Music City. So Paul's done a lot of great things, but one of the most important things that Paul has done is written a couple of great books. One of them we're going to dive into in more detail because that's the book that I helped Paul create an awesome audiobook narration, which he has narrated. So let's bring on to the show Mr. Paul Schatzkin.
Hello, Robert.
Welcome. Glad you're here.
Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Looking good. Yeah, so it was a pleasure to work on your book and help you create the audiobook for The Boy Who Invented Television. You grew up back east. Well, you were born in New York City, right? And then you grew up and were raised in New Jersey.
Yeah, I like to tell people I was raised in Springsteen country, Monmouth County, New Jersey. My grandparents and parents would take me to Asbury Park when I was a kid, and that's where, Bruce got his start at the Stone Pony Club on the boardwalk in Asbury Park. In fact, I was just back there recently for the first time. The Stone Pony is still there. And so that's where I was raised, in the same part of New Jersey that Bruce writes about.
Nice.
Yeah.
And I think maybe we've talked about it before, or maybe I read it somewhere, but I think we probably had a conversation about you as a writer and as a journalist. Is that something that you studied in college?
I didn't really study journalism, and my academic career was, I think we'd be putting it charitably to say it was kind of checkered. I Yeah, one of the running jokes is I did get a degree from Antioch College, but I basically majored in joint rolling. It was the 1960s, but I focused a big part of my academic career using the very first portable video technology that became available in the early 1970s to develop programming for local cable stations in what kind of became the public access movement as cable began to spread in the 1970s and 80s. So I was kind of at the forefront of that. That is essentially what got me to where I am today. But I went from doing that. I graduated from college in 1973, and I know it's hard to believe because, of course, I don't look that old. But when I graduated from college in 73, I took what I had learned with that technology out to Los Angeles and worked in the television industry from about 1973 until about 1980. And the kind of the highlight of my career was working on an ABC sitcom called The Barney Miller Show. And we did some very pioneering video editing work on that. And this was really in the very early days of strictly analog video editing, when everything was on tape, and most of the time that you spent in the editing room was spent waiting for the tape to get there. It wasn't like the instantaneous random access that you have now, where you just go boom, boom, boom and jump around. We had to wait for the tapes to shuttle.
Yep. When I went to college and I started studying broadcasting, because I have a degree in broadcasting, radio, television, and mass communications as certificates as well. Yeah. One of the first things we did was learn how to edit on those giant 3/4-inch tape machines. With this, it was a little bit.
Are you talking about, was it the Sony U-matic video cassette recorders? Yes. Yeah, yes. I did some work with that in LA in the 70s. Most of the work that I did was on open reel IVC reel-to-reel machines, but the work that I did, the Sony U-matic video cassettes, didn't really come out until I think around 73 or so. So we were working with a standard called EIAJ1, which was the very first portable helical scan video technology, and that was half-inch tape.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the Emmy nomination, was that for the work that you were doing on Barney Miller?
Yeah, that was on the Barney Miller Show. And the Barney Miller Show was recorded in a very unique fashion. You're probably familiar with the live cutting 4-camera on stage system that most situation comedies use, or live television uses, where you have 3 or 4 cameras on stage and the director is cutting between them in real time. And that's how most of the video comedies, like all of the Norman Lear comedies, were done in the 70s. But the man who created the Barney Miller Show, his name was Danny Arnold. May he rest in peace. And Danny was not at all megalomaniacal, but we did imagine that someday we would create a crawl that says, written by Danny Arnold, directed by Danny Arnold, produced by Danny Arnold, all primary parts performed by Danny Arnold and performed live in front of Danny Arnold. And so he wanted so much control that rather than letting his directors cut live between the cameras and then having some isolated footage to use for editing, he recorded all 4 cameras continuously. And then he shot film style, piece by piece by piece, on all 4 cameras. And we would wind up with, we had these towers. They were like pylons that had four reels on each pylon. And there were like 16 hours of tape for each 30-minute show.
That's wild. And I have to say the look, the aesthetic look of the show was different, was unique.
Yeah, Danny was looking for a film look with that show, and I do remember he had a very special cinematographer, DP. I guess we called them videographers in those days, but his last name was Digby, and I've forgotten his first name now. But he came from film. And I'll think of it. The first name will strike me. I will interrupt the conversation when I remember his George. It was George Digby, and George worked very hard to get that kind of soft, slightly grainy film look to the Barney Miller Show, which was very different from the very hard, light look of most of the situation comedies of that era.
Yeah, it really stood out for sure.
Yeah,
which really gave it a unique look.
Yeah.
So
and we submitted one of the episodes from the 1978 season to the Emmys, and we actually wound up losing to a show that was on PBS called The Addams Chronicles, which was the life of the whole John Adams family. And it was kind of a precursor to the HBO series that came out many years later with Paul Giamatti in the role of John Adams. And you can't find it anywhere. I would like very much to see that again. But that was in the very early days of using video as a production medium, because it was either live TV or film. Even for example, all the Desilu comedy, I Love Lucy, they pioneered in a multi-camera film format. So they had 3 cameras on stage and blocked and shot, but they recorded everything on film and then went and edited the film. So by the time we get to the early 70s, video has finally come of age to the point where they're using it as the recording medium, but it was still all analog, obviously.
Yeah. And, again, this is really fascinating. And for people who aren't really aware of what was involved with the media, with television, with film, of how you produced and edited content. Now we have we have Pro Tools, which is what I use for audio. We have great. Now I'm going blank. Avid.
You're thinking of now I'm spacing on it too. The Apple program.
Yeah, I can't.
Studio?
Yeah. I can't. Boy, I tell you, my brain is just not.
I remember my brain. It was a good brain.
I'll remember it during the break.
George Digby.
Right.
No, actually, it was George Dibby. It wasn't Digby. It was Dibby. George Dibby. Yeah. I can see him now, adjusting those lights to get just the right look on this.
Yeah, but it's fascinating to understand that there was a process of editing, that it wasn't just we're being in the nonlinear world where you can just move things around and insert and do all which is great tools to have in the business, but I think it's important. I'm glad that when I got into the entertainment business, it was part of the transition over to going strictly digital. We still were doing analog things. When I first started working the business, I was working in radio, and everything was reel to reel. And if you had to do edits, you're cutting and splicing tape, just like you would do with video. You're cutting and splicing tape and piecing things together. But I feel it really helped create a solid foundation.
Yeah.
to where
And
I am now.
the period that we're talking about here in the early to mid 70s is really the beginning of the transition,
Yeah.
the end of which we're beginning to experience now, because even though the recordings were analog, a lot of the control was in the very early stages of digital processing. And we edited the Barney Miller Show on a machine called a Datatron. And it was a quasi-digital machine. I don't think we had quite gotten to the point of the microprocessors like the 8080 and the 8088 that paved the way to the technology that we have now. I remember being in one of the editing bays and somebody starting to talk about that stuff during that period around 1977, 78, when I was working on the Barney Miller Show. That stuff was just coming to light, but we were already using automated and slightly digital controls because we had the time code. So that was a digital kind of thing. And the job of the machines in those days was literally you had to get the playback machine on one side synced up with the recording machine on the other side. And a lot of the technology was just about getting those two machines synced up and in the same place, and then automating the place where the recording machine switched and started recording the input from the playback machine. I mean, it was that primitive, but that, as you say, laid the foundation for everything that we have now. And at the same time, the earliest, it was the arrival of video that paved the way for the popularization of all the communications that we have at our disposal now. That was the very beginning of that. Those Sony Portapacks that somebody put in my hand in the summer of 1970, I think, was the real beginning of the revolution. That was the beginning of the media being wrested from the hands of the gatekeepers, which still took 40 years.
For a second, Paul. We gotta go for a break.
Okay.
We will be back. And by the way, it's Final Cut. Final Cut's what I was trying to think of.
Final Cut Pro. Sure, right. Yeah.
You are listening to the Your Book, Your Voice podcast. I'm your host, Robert A. Lane with Robert Lane Coaching. We're speaking with Paul Schatzkin, who's written a couple of great books. When we come back from the break, we are going to talk about the boy who invented television, a fantastic book, and you're going to be fascinated. Don't go away. We are streaming live on the Bold Brave TV network.
What if there were a super tiny device that could diagnose the brain and is smaller than a single human hair? What if you could see inside the brain to help an epilepsy patient during surgery or to help the fight against Parkinson's disease? Dr. Patricia Broderick is proud to announce the Broderick Probe, a biomedical and electronic breakthrough. Imagine a probe to help with the understanding and potential cure of brain-related diseases. To learn more, listen live to the Easy Sense radio show with host Dr. Broderick, Wednesdays 7 p.m. Eastern on the Bold Brave Media Network and TuneIn Radio. And to help support the Broderick Foundation, please go to EasySense.com and learn how, with your help, we can fight these horrific brain disorders. That's EasySense.com to learn more and help support the Broderick Foundation. Author, radio show host, and coach John M. Hawkins reveals strategies to help gain perspective, build confidence, find clarity, achieve goals. John M. Hawkins' new book, Coached to Greatness, Unlock Your Full Potential with Limitless Growth, published by iUniverse. Hawkins reveals strategies to help readers accomplish more. He believes the book can coach them to greatness. Hawkins says that the best athletes get to the top of their sport with the help of coaches, mentors, and others. He shares guidance that helps readers reflect on what motivates them, rediscover and assess their core values, philosophies, and competencies, find settings that allow them to be the most productive, and track their progress towards accomplishing goals. Listen to John Hawkins' My Strategy, Saturdays, 1 p.m. Eastern on the BBM Global Network and TuneIn Radio.
All right, welcome back to the Your Book, Your Voice podcast. I'm Robert A. Lane with Robert Lane Coaching. My very special guest is author Paul Schatzkin, and we're going to dive into a fantastic book that he wrote that I had the pleasure of working with Paul and helping him create the audiobook, which of course Paul narrates and did a great job. And then and I tell this story a lot, Paul. I just want to share this with you that
Sure.
when I talk to other authors, and even when I, doing my coffee chats or anything else, I say this story. I said, when I am listening, when I'm doing the final mixing and output of a chapter of a book, I always think of your book, because what makes a great audiobook is when, and I hear this stuff all the time, I'm listening and doing my mix, but I get so sucked into the story. And that's a testament to you and to the authors who are narrating their audiobook of how good of a job that you did sharing
Thank
your
you.
story. And, and it's like, and there were times when like, okay, Paul, where's the next chapter? I want to know what happens next.
Oh, I hope we're reaching a vast audience tonight.
But it is a great book. And for those of you who are just tuning in maybe on the podcast, Paul's written a book called The Boy Who Invented Television. And this is a fantastic story. It's a biography of Philo T. Farnsworth, who is really the person that you can trace back to the roots of television's creation. A lot of people don't know who Philo T. Farnsworth is. They may know Philo T. Farnsworth from Futurama because they did borrow his name and created that character, loosely based on that character. But Philo T. Farnsworth is or was a real person and a real inventor. And Paul just wrote this incredible book that shares his story. So my first question for you, Paul, is this: when did you first hear about Philo T. Farnsworth?
We'll go back to the summer of 1973, just as I was graduating from that class in Antioch College. Now, I mentioned that I was working in the very early days of what eventually became public access cable television. And those of us that worked in that field, using primarily those portable Sony, but we call them portable, they were boxes the size of a small suitcase, and cameras, that stuck out from your eye like this. But they were the first video technology that was made available and affordable to the rank and file. Mm-hmm. And those of us who were experimenting with that technology, we all kind of unified around a publication that came out of New York starting in 1970 called Radical Software. And we read that, and that's where we got a lot of ideas about what to do with this technology and how to propagate it and what sort of things to shoot and what sort of techniques to use. But in the spring of 1973, that publication out of New York farmed the summer 73 edition to some writers and designers in San Francisco. And they put together this edition of Radical Software called the Video City Edition, because I learned in its pages that San Francisco is where video first arrived on the planet in the summer of 1927. And as I was going through the pages of this issue of Radical Software, I began to see photographs of prehistoric television that I had never seen before. And that's where I first learned the name of a man I had never heard of before, the unlikely Philo T. Farnsworth. And began to learn then that this is the story of somebody who, as a teenager, as a child, living in the sticks of Utah and Idaho, knew just about enough of the technology of the earliest 20th century to begin thinking about the next step. The likelihood that what we already knew as radio, what we already knew as motion pictures, would somehow find a way to merge, and the motion pictures would be sent through the air. And Philo Farnsworth had it in mind to become an inventor, and he figured the thing to invent, to launch a career as an inventor, would be this new thing on the horizon called television. And that's the story that I began to learn in 1973.
Yeah, and what's so fascinating is here's really, which makes sense about the title of The Boy Who Invented Television.
Yeah, he was literally 14 years old when he had the conception. Now, just I don't mean to interrupt, but
Yeah.
one of the things that I learned on this journey was that within the inventor community, the moment of conception, when an inventor has the idea that he will later develop, that's actually considered the moment of invention. And when he produces it on a laboratory bench, that's considered reducing the idea to practice. So it was actually invented conceptually in the summer of 1921. The first sketches were drawn in the spring of 1922, and he produced it on a laboratory bench in 1927.
Right. And in your book, I know you go through the whole story of that, coming up with that idea, which, to me is really mind-boggling to think that someone back, who's a 14-year-old kid who's out in the fields, plowing fields, turns around and looks at these lines that he's been plowing and, to make this connection of TV line.
What everybody knew was that in order to turn light into electricity, the image was going to have to somehow be broken down into component parts that could then be turned into a stream of electricity. But to me, what's important about this story is that it kind of denotes the demarcation point between mechanical and electronic and even quantum technologies. And what I've been thinking a lot as I've been thinking about this story lately is that it's very important to recognize that Philo T. Farnsworth was born in 1906, which was the year after Einstein turned science on his head with the 4 papers that he wrote in 1905. Now, up to that point, the attempts to break the image down into its component parts and convert them into a stream of electricity were done with a variety of mechanical devices, spinning wheels that had a spiral of holes along them that would cause a different line of light to be transmitted to a photocell. So it was an electromechanical approach. Hello. So we have Philo Farnsworth born the year after Einstein's transformed the world with the foundations of quantum mechanics. Now, this is the rhetorical question that I like to ask at this point in the story. Einstein is most known for relativity and E equals mc squared. But do you know what he won his Nobel Prize for?
That's a good question.
And a surprising answer, because the very first paper that Einstein released in 1905 was the articulation and quantification of the photoelectric effect, the process by which light becomes electricity. And Philo Farnsworth, being born into an era that had never known, an era that had never not known that kind of quantum mechanics, came at it from an entirely different angle. So as he's learning about electrons and magnetic deflection in cathode ray tubes, he's bringing what he's learned at a young age about the photoelectric effect and Albert Einstein's theories and brings all that to bear to deliver what is a truly revolutionary device with the very first electronic camera tube.
Right. And the one thing that I want to bring up, and I know you've talked about this before in our conversations, is that every video device that people use can be traced back to the sketch that Philo T. Farnsworth, which is really incredible that the technology that we have today is traced back to this inventor that most people don't even know about.
Right. So this point of demarcation that I speak of is really important, and because of the history that comes later has been lost to history and swept under the rug because it didn't serve the corporate interests that dominated communications as we get into the 1930s and 40s, and that's a big part of the story. But as I said, he had the idea in 1921, And in the spring, he thought about it some more. And in the spring of 1922, he goes into his high school science teacher's classroom and he draws literally this sketch. Is that going to show up? Yeah.
Kind of.
Yeah. Well,
there it is. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah,
So
good.
that is the actual sketch that he hand drew for his high school chemistry teacher in 1922. And my contention is that every video screen on the planet can trace its origins to that sketch, because that's the point of demarcation that made all the mechanical technology that came before it obsolete, and all the technology that came after it, from analog to digital to everything we enjoy now, possible.
Absolutely. You're listening to the Your Book, Your Voice podcast. I'm your host, Robert A. Lane. We do need to take a quick break. We're talking about a fantastic book that Paul Schatzkin has written and also created an audiobook with, called The Boy Who Invented Television. It's fascinating. Don't go away, because we're going to talk a little bit more about Philo T. Farnsworth's career and how he got swept under the rug and why he is not a household name as he should be. So don't go away. We're streaming live on the Bold Brave TV network. We'll be right back.
Did you know that your beliefs create your entire reality, but it's the subconscious beliefs that do most of the creating? Belief shifter and life coach Shiraz can help you identify those limiting beliefs and eliminate them, often in a single session.
Like, it was almost instant. Like, I had relief right away.
Creating better health, relationships, careers, and finances. Let Shiraz help you step out of safety and into awareness.
Definitely something's happening. It's like a flow inside. You know, it feels good.
Whether in person or online, Shiraz provides personal coaching, belief shifting. Visit Shiraz at energeticmagic.com or call 416-529-7429. Energetic Magic on the BBM Global Network, Tuesdays at 7 p.m. Eastern. Find your greater happiness. Be well. Be aware. Be magical.
Are you struggling to care for elderly parents or a spouse? Do you wonder if being a caregiver is making you sick? Are you worried about taking time off work to care for elderly parents and balance work, life, and caregiving? Has caregiving become exhausting and emotionally draining? Are you an aging adult who wants to remain independent, but you're not sure how? I'm Pamela D. Wilson. Join me for the Caring Generation radio show for caregivers and aging adults, Wednesday evenings, 6 Pacific, 7 Mountain, 8 Central, and 9 Eastern, where I answer these questions and share tips for managing stress, family relationships, health, well-being, and more. Podcasts and transcripts of The Caring Generation are on my website, PamelaDWilson.com, plus my caregiving library, online caregiver support programs, and programs for corporations interested in supporting working caregivers. Help, hope, and support for caregivers is here on The Caring Generation and PamelaDWilson.com.
And welcome back to the Your Book, Your Voice podcast. We're talking with author Paul Schatzkin and getting a little bit of a deep dive into his book, The Boy Who Invented Television, which is about Philo T. Farnsworth, who is the boy who did invent television. We're talking about his life. We just discussed about how he came up with the concept, which is pretty fascinating for somebody who was only 14 years old. But what I like to do now, Paul, is let's hit on some of the key points in Philo's career, because he was just gangbusters for quite a few years, and then things just kind of turned in a different direction.
Let's see if we can get up to about 1940, and then I guess we'll jump into the late 50s and 60s, because there's a lot of interesting details there. So we've already already covered the initial dates: the conception in 1921, the first disclosure in the sketch in 1922, and then the reduction to practice in 1927. He met somebody, a financier from San Francisco. He met him in Salt Lake City. His name was George Everson. They met in Salt Lake City in 1926. George just asked what his plans were. He said he had this idea. George said, well, it's a wild, crazy idea, but I've got some mad money tucked aside. I will give you that. And they moved him to San Francisco. They got some more money from some what we now would call venture capitalists, some financiers associated with the Crocker Bank. In 1926, they gave him a year and $25,926 to prove that the idea would work. And we have a laboratory journal from September 7th, 1927, and it understates the importance of the eureka moment that it was. But after several unsuccessful attempts with the system that he devised, with the camera tube that he called the image dissector, and the receiver display tube that he called the image oscillite, that's the camera and receiver tube, both cathode ray tubes. There's a note that on September 7th, the received line picture was evident this time. And that language literally announces the arrival of video on the planet in 1927. And everything, as I said, that we have had since started at that moment. And all it was a simple line. They drew a line on a sheet of glass, held it in front of some very hot lights, put it between the lights and the image dissector tube, and when they rotated it, they could see that the image was rotating on the receiver screen. And that meant that information was being transmitted from the bottom of one bottle to the bottom of another bottle. Television has arrived. Earlier that year, they had applied for patents. So the patent application date is 1927. And by 1928-29, the system is coming along. They are making rapid improvements. And this is the important thing that I learned. When you are the very first in a field like this, you are going to be light years ahead of the competition. And so they were developing advances and building an impregnable portfolio of patents from 1927 until even the first patent was issued and now became a rock-solid document in 1930. But by then, the knowledge of Farnsworth's work had begun to spread from the West Coast to the East Coast, where the dominant force in the broadcasting industry was a company called the Radio Corporation of America, or RCA. And RCA was controlled by a man named David Sarnoff, and the company was formed around the idea that as in the 1920s, all these technologies were split up into various trusts. The Radio Corporation became essentially the Radio Trust, and all the patents for broadcasting were invested in the Radio Corporation of America, which Sarnoff liked to say the Radio Corporation was formed to collect patent royalties and not to pay them. So anytime they encountered new technology that could improve or advance the art, they either acquired that technology or put the company out of business and acquired it in bankruptcy. It was a very ruthless process. But Sarnoff knew that his patents had a limited life and that they would begin to expire. So he begins looking over the horizon for what might take the place of radio as we go into the 1930s. And of course, the answer is television.
Right.
And then he finds out that somebody in San Francisco has come up with a completely electronic way of transmitting pictures through the air. And in the spring of 1930, he sends his own engineer, a man named Vladimir Zworykin, to San Francisco to see what Farnsworth has got. At the time, this is where it becomes industrial espionage. At the time, Zworykin was still working for Westinghouse, but he was coming to RCA. So before he went to RCA, he went out to San Francisco under the pretense of exploring a patent license for Westinghouse. Had Farnsworth known that he was going to RCA, he would have been far less forthcoming, showing him what he had in San Francisco. But the story is that as soon as Zworykin spent 3 days prowling around, was the way they put it, prowling around the Farnsworth lab, learned all of his techniques. And before he left, remember, telegrams were real expensive in 1930. He sent a 300-word telegram to a laboratory in Pittsburgh at Westinghouse, giving him the specs for an image to sector tube. And then on his way back to the East Coast, he stopped in Pittsburgh, picked up that image to sector tube, took it to Camden, to where he went to work for RCA. And now RCA also had the means to develop an electronic television system.
So he went there and he
stole it. Beginnings of the industrial intrigue around the introduction of television in the 1930s.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Sarnoff and RCA basically stole the idea, and which of course now leads to the legal battles that Sarnoff was trying to do to Philo T. Farnsworth. Can you share a little more detail about that?
Yeah, there's one clause in the patent that was issued in 1930, applied for in 1927 and issued in 1930. Claim 15 describes the electrical image. And simply put, it's the idea that you have the optical image forming here, and then the electrical counterpart to the optical image, where the photoelectric effect takes place. And then that is then scanned to produce the train of electricity. That's the idea that he got in the potato field when he saw the rows that he had plowed. That is the legal terminology that announces electronic video to the world. The catch was that in 1923, Zworykin had applied for a patent for an electronic television system that, if it had worked, would have predated Farnsworth's.
Right.
And RCA acquired the rights to Zworykin's application, which by then was not a patent. It was an application for a patent that had never been granted, but it had an earlier date. And so there was litigation throughout the 1930s where RCA is trying to make the case in the patent court that Zworykin's application predates Farnsworth's application, and that Zworykin is entitled to the claim embodied in Claim 15, the electrical image. And in a resounding decision delivered in 1935, the patent court says Zworykin has no right to make that case, to make that claim. And the priority of invention to the critical wording that announces the arrival of video in the world was granted to Philo T. Farnsworth in 1935, but RCA continued to contest other elements of the patent portfolio throughout the 1930s. And as we get into the later 1930s, the stresses of continuing to develop television, of having to fight with his financiers over adequate financing, and to deal with RCA in patent litigation began to take a toll on Philo Farnsworth, and he just retreated and left the scene in 1940.
Yeah, there's two things that come to mind. One is the drawing that you showed that he wrote or drew was a key factor of showing RCA's lawyers, hey, here it is.
Yeah, they found both the attorneys for both sides went to Salt Lake City and found Justin Tolman, the teacher from 1922 for whom that sketch had been drawn, and he still had that sketch.
Yeah.
And that was the actual paper that he had drawn it on, and I guess it's in the National Archive somewhere as part of that patent litigation.
Yeah. And then the other thing is, God, what was I was going to tell you something or ask you something. Sorry, my mind is just drawing another blank. Don't
cut me loose, because I'll just keep going. Huh? Go ahead.
when you were talking about the financiers, there's one of them, Jess McCarger, right?
Yeah.
Was not really an easy person to get along with, and really rubbed Philo T. Farnsworth lab team in a very bad way. And I know you talk about it in your book, The Boy Who Invented Television, about when he got all pissed off and came in there and told Philo to fire everybody, and Philo said no, and then McCarger went down there and fired everybody. Himself. Now, my question to you, Paul, and this is just insight maybe, but is there a reason why Philo just didn't follow after him and boot him out of there? Could he have not had any more say?
He was beholden at that point to the financiers. They held the purse strings, and he had a board of directors that he that he no longer controlled. And there had been instances prior to this where his lab gang, his critical team of people who understood what he wanted and how to deliver it to him, there had been previous instances. So you're talking about the instance in 1936 where now television should have been on the cusp of commercial introduction, and the spigots of return should have opened, but they still haven't, primarily because of this protracted litigation with RCA. And so, I mean, it's an interesting question to ask. Why didn't he kick McCarger out? And it's because he didn't have enough control to do that. And the men all walked out, and he tried to hire some of them back. But at that point, it became obvious that the company was going to have to be reconstituted and reformulated. And even that took a couple of years. But what his son called the gem-like flame that had nurtured electronic television into the world went out at that point, and that was the last.
Yeah, and I consider that one of the turning points, that really started this downturn of.
Yeah, and it's a longer story than that. But when people ask me why haven't we heard of Farnsworth, I'll say there's basically three reasons. The first being he was not inclined to dwell on his past accomplishments. The second is that there are pretenders to the throne, so to speak, of who deserves the title. And the third real reason is he was not survived by his own company. And so we're fast forwarding now into the late 1940s. The company did very well during World War II, but as a lot of companies did, it faltered in the wake of the consumerization of the economy, and wound up being sold out to AT&T in 1949.
Right. All right. We're going to have to take a quick break. We have one more break. I do want to wrap things up with some things that Philo did later on in his career that I think are fascinating and are still important to this day. So I do want to touch on that. We are streaming live on the Bull Brave TV network. This is the Your Book, Your Voice podcast. My special guest being Paul Schatzkin, an author who wrote the book, The Boy Who Invented Television. And there it is. And also, Paul, I just want to touch on just a little bit about the audiobook process and how it felt for you when we come back. So don't go away. We got more stuff coming your way.
Mike Zorek, a three-time California state champion in Greco-Roman wrestling at 114 pounds. Mike, blind since birth, was born in Hartford, Connecticut. He was a six-time national placer, including 2 seconds, 2/3, and 2/4. He also won the Veterans Folk-Style Wrestling twice at 152 pounds. In all these tournaments, he was the only blind competitor. Nancy Zorek, a creative spirit whose talents have taken her to the stage and into galleries and exhibitions in several states. Her father, a commercial artist who shared his instruments with his daughter and helped her fine-tune her natural abilities, influenced her decision to follow in his footsteps. Ms. Zorek has enjoyed a fruitful career doing what she loves. Listen Saturday mornings at 12 Eastern for the Nancy and Mike Show for heartwarming stories and interesting talk on the BBM Global Network. Dr. RC will share extraordinary resources and services that promote educational success, as well as making a difference in the lives of all social workers, as well as the lives of children, adolescents, and teens of today. She will have open discussions addressing many of the issues that we face about our youth and how being employed in the uniquely skilled profession of social work for over 18 years has taught invaluable lessons through her personal experiences. She will also provide real-life facts, examples, and personal stories that will confirm that why serving as a child advocate is extremely beneficial when addressing the needs of the whole child. Listen live to Dare to Soar, Saturdays 10 a.m. Eastern on the BBM Global Network, and TuneIn Radio as Dr. RC will provide thought-provoking information that will empower, encourage, and strengthen students, families, and communities across our nation. You can also visit her at soarwithkatie.com.
Okay, welcome back. We are here with you, the Your Book, Your Voice podcast. I'm your host, Robert A. Lane with Robert Lane Coaching. And we've been talking with Paul Schatzkin, who's been sharing an incredibly interesting and fascinating story about the boy who invented television. That's the name of his book. He recorded an awesome audiobook that goes along with it. And it's just such a great read and such a great listen. Definitely pick that up. It's on Audible, Amazon, and Apple. I know we don't have too much more time, but Paul, I do want you, if you could share with us the latter portion of Philo T. Farnsworth's career, because he did actually get into some really interesting inventions.
Yeah, his work is still relevant today. And raises a lot of questions about why some of the things that he worked with in the latter years of his life are not available to us now. So the quick way to get into this is to say that he did begin to retreat and begin to digest all the things that he had learned. He now had 10 years in a laboratory working with all of the quantum forces that had been identified at the turn of the 20th century. I would contend that Philo T. Farnsworth had more firsthand experience with quantum forces than anybody in the 1930s. And he was fairly renowned during that period for what he had done. He was fairly well known. And then we get into 1940 and the specter of World War II on the horizon, and he retreats to a farm in Maine. And here is where I ask the rhetorical question: do you know who was the most renowned scientist of the day who did not participate in the Manhattan Project? That would be Philo T. Farnsworth.
Farnsworth, yeah.
Who was actually approached at one point in around 1940 or 41 and asked if he would work on a secret project in Chicago, which turns out to be Enrico Fermi's atomic pile, which was the precursor to the work being done in Los Alamos, the first controlled fission reaction. And he was invited to come to this secret project, and he said to his wife, "I think they're working on an atomic bomb, and I want nothing to do with it." So he is already thinking about other aspects of how the strong nuclear force, which is what is released in a nuclear reaction, what holds protons together in an atomic nucleus, he's starting to think about other ways of releasing that energy. And he's thinking about the process of nuclear fusion, not fission. And that's the process that we see in the sun and all the stars, and is also what makes a hydrogen bomb go boom. But he begins to imagine in the 1940s that he has seen things in his experiments in his laboratory that might offer a key to solving the riddle of how do you bottle a star. And so I'll fast forward to 1948. He actually has a conversation with Albert Einstein. Einstein tells him, "You must continue this work because this is the good part of my ideas," after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And in the 1950s, he begins building a nuclear fusion reactor. The moment of conception was in 1953. Again, he sat on it. And on the back of the book, there's a picture of his very first experiment with a nuclear fusion device from about 1959 or 60. And he worked on that through the 1960s, but he had grave reservations about what the result would be. And it's not that it's anything like a bomb. It's a clean, safe process, but it alters the ecological, economic, and even political and cultural landscape of civilization if that kind of technology becomes available. And he basically, I believe, came to the conclusion that this species, these apes with nukes, were not ready for that technology, and took the secret to his grave.
Yeah. And, you hear about...
That's a long, interesting story condensed into a couple of sentences. A paragraph.
Well, I'll tell you, those of you who are tuning in, you got to pick up this book, The Boy Who Invented Television, because there's so much great information. And Paul, I do have to say that, your delivery, your audiobook narration delivery is really great. It, again, as I mentioned earlier, I listen to this stuff all the time when I'm editing, and it was so compelling, and it really was engaging, and I loved listening to you tell this story. So how was the actual process of creating the audiobook? How did that go?
Well, I would say the process of creating the audiobook was kind of a revelation for me, and I'm so grateful to you for just coaxing me into that world, because it was something that I had wanted to do for a long time. And what I discovered as I was reading the book, and there was a process of adapting and kind of learning how to do it. And by the time I kind of hit my pace a couple of chapters in, but what I realized was, first of all, that I had written the book as I speak. And so it was then very natural, once I got the rhythm of it, to speak the book as I had written it. And so when I do hear portions of it, I thought, yeah, that's exactly the way I was thinking of it when the characters went down on the paper. And trust me, when I started writing this book, it was done on paper. I started writing this in 1977. And cut and paste meant scissors and tape.
Right. Well, and you bring up a really great point, because and I say this all the time, is your voice is in your written word. And when you narrate your audiobook, you're just bringing it to life. You're preserving the integrity of your author brand, of your voice. And that is so important, which is why I say all nonfiction authors really do need to narrate their own audiobook, because no one can speak your story better than you. We're just about out of time.
Okay. Well, I will offer my final testimony. That process works. Your book, your voice, it works.
Thank you. I appreciate that. If anybody is interested and wants more information about the Your Book, Your Voice audiobook coaching program, just go to my website at robertlanecoaching.com. You'll have all the information there. Schedule your call with me. We'll talk with you. We'll get you enrolled. Now for Paul, again, get his book. It's on Amazon. It's on Apple Books. It is on Audible. It is a great listen and a great read. You're going to love it. Is there any other place that people can get more information about Philo T. Farnsworth, Paul?
The stuff that I've written about Farnsworth over the years, I have at a website called farnovision.com. And the origin of that is years ago when I was working with an agent who was trying to sell the story to television. You'd think they'd have done it by now. He sort of asked the rhetorical question. He said, well, if television was invented by somebody named Farnsworth, why don't we call it Farnovision? And so that name stuck. And so when I started getting on the web back in the 90s, I got the domain farnovision.com. And that's where I've gathered all the stuff about.
Okay. Thank you so much, Paul, for joining us. I know we only
thank you, Robert. It's been great. Yeah.
Again, this is the Your Book, Your Voice podcast. I'm Robert A. Lane, my special guest, Paul Schatzkin, great author. Thank you so much for tuning in. We'll be talking to you next week, my friends. Take care.
This has been Your Book, Your Voice with host Robert A. Lane. Tune in each week for another powerful and informative episode of Your Book, Your Voice, Thursdays, 8 p.m. Eastern on the Bold Brave TV network.